In 1789, the streets of Paris ran red as the elite lived in unimaginable luxury while the masses starved. In 1917, Russia's aristocrats clung to their fortunes as millions faced famine and war. And now, in 2025 America, the top 1% holds more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Could history be repeating itself on U.S. soil? Are we ignoring the warning signs that once toppled empires? The gap isn't just about money, it's about the fragile trust that holds society together. How long before it shatters? Across history, societies that split between the extremely wealthy and the struggling majority have rarely survived without upheaval. In France, on the eve of 1789, the top 1% controlled nearly all land, wealth, and political power. Peasants paid crippling taxes, while the aristocracy threw lavish balls, unaware the storm was brewing. Entire villages starved. Bread riots erupted in the streets. The king's coffers were full, but the people's stomachs were empty. Within months, the French Revolution would ignite, toppling a centuries-old monarchy and reshaping Europe forever. Russia tells a similar story. By 1917, the Tsar and his elite lived in palaces, while the majority endured famine, inflation, and endless war. The contrast was staggering. A tiny aristocracy flaunting unimaginable wealth as soldiers and workers froze, hungry and desperate. Trust in the system evaporated, and the empire collapsed almost overnight. History shows that extreme inequality isn't just an economic issue, it's a social time bomb. Fast forward to America today. The gap is astonishing. The top 1% now owns more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Median household income has barely budged in decades. While billionaires' fortunes soar, entire industries are dominated by a handful of companies, consolidating wealth and influence at the top. The middle class, once the backbone of the nation, is shrinking faster than at any point in modern history. Social mobility is stalling. The pattern is unmistakable. When the majority struggles to survive while a minority thrives unchecked, societies fracture. Civil unrest, political polarization, and economic instability follow. The question isn't whether history will repeat itself, it's when, and the warning signs are flashing red. History has a way of repeating itself, often in patterns we fail to see until it's too late. Take France, 1,780 seconds. The kingdom's debt had skyrocketed to over 4 billion livres, largely due to wars and royal extravagance. Meanwhile, the majority of French citizens spent over half their income just to feed their families. Bread riots became routine. The upper class believed their privilege was untouchable. They assumed stability was permanent. Then came the 14th of July, 1789. The Bastille fell, and centuries of monarchy crumbled in days. The turning point was clear. When inequality becomes unbearable, the social contract fractures, and trust in institutions evaporates overnight. Russia, just over a century later, followed a similar trajectory. By 1917, inflation had doubled, food shortages were rampant, and the Tsarist government was paralyzed by war. The aristocracy enjoyed lavish lifestyles, oblivious to the suffering around them. Workers and soldiers, desperate and starving, began to revolt. In March, the February Revolution forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, ending over 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Within months, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, promising equity and justice. Again, a tipping point emerged when the wealth gap, combined with political incompetence, reached a critical mass. Even outside outright revolutions, economic inequality has triggered financial and social crises. In 1929, the U.S. stock market crash wasn't caused by poverty, but by a system where wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. Speculation ran rampant, and ordinary citizens were over-leveraged and underprotected. By the end of the year, 16 million shares were wiped out, banks failed, and unemployment soared to 25%. The disparity between the wealthy elite and struggling Americans created the conditions for the Great Depression, a decade-long economic nightmare. The pattern was unmistakable. Extreme concentration of wealth, coupled with lack of accountability, breeds instability. Even in modern times, inequality has left nations vulnerable. In Latin America during the 1980 debt crisis, countries like Mexico and Argentina accumulated massive debts, while a small elite controlled major industries. When global interest rates spiked, the masses were left to bear the burden. Social unrest surged, inflation soared, and governments were forced into austerity measures that fueled political instability for years. History shows a repeating cycle. Wealth concentrates, the majority suffers, trust erodes, and crisis strikes whether political, economic, or social. Across these examples, a clear pattern emerges. 1. Wealth is concentrated at the top. 2. The majority struggles to meet basic needs. 3. Political or financial institutions fail to act. 4. Social trust collapses. 5. A tipping point triggers dramatic change, revolution, collapse, or crisis. France, Russia, the US. Latin America, different times, different places, same warning signs. When the majority perceives the system as rigged, unrest becomes inevitable. When elites ignore the warning signs, the collapse accelerates. The story repeats, relentlessly, as if history itself is reminding us. Inequality unchecked is a silent, ticking bomb. Today, the echoes of history are impossible to ignore. In the United States, the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90% combined, a level of inequality not seen since the Gilded Age over a century ago. Billionaires' fortunes are measured in hundreds of billions, while median household income has stagnated around $70,000, adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, over 40 million Americans live below the official poverty line, and millions more struggle with medical debt, student loans, and housing costs that have outpaced wages for decades. The middle class, the backbone of American society, has been shrinking steadily. In 1970, roughly 60% of Americans were middle class. Today, that number hovers around 50%. Social mobility is declining. Studies show that a child born into the bottom fifth of income distribution has only about a 4% chance of reaching the top fifth as an adult. The American dream, once a promise of upward mobility, feels increasingly out of reach for the majority. Corporate power mirrors historical concentrations of wealth. Just 10 corporations now control nearly 90% of media, giving a few individuals outsized influence over information, culture, and politics. Tech giants dominate markets and capture wealth at unprecedented rates. The political system, heavily influenced by campaign financing and lobbying, amplifies the voices of the rich while the struggles of ordinary citizens often go unheard. If we overlay this with history, the pattern is striking. France, Russia, and even the United States in 1929 all show the same warning signs. Extreme wealth concentrated in a tiny elite, a struggling majority burdened by stagnating wages and debt, political institutions increasingly unresponsive to the needs of the many. Growing public frustration, polarization, and distrust. America is not yet in open revolt, but the warning signs are flashing. Social unrest is rising. Protests over inequality, racial injustice, and economic precarity have surged in the past decade. Trust in government institutions has dropped to historic lows. The social fabric is fraying. Just as in past societies, when these gaps widen without intervention, instability follows not slowly, but suddenly, and often unpredictably. History isn't destiny, but it is a mirror. Patterns of wealth, power, and societal stress repeat themselves, and right now, America is reflecting an uncomfortable truth. The same forces that toppled empires and triggered revolutions are gathering momentum on U.S. soil. The question isn't whether the system will be tested, it's how far the pressure will build before it reaches a breaking point. History is relentless in its lessons, and the logic behind societal collapse is surprisingly simple. Societies do not crumble because of inequality alone. They crumble because the elite ignore the warning signs, and trust in institutions erodes. France, Russia, the U.S. in 1929, Latin America in the 1,980 seconds, all followed the same sequence. Wealth concentrated, the majority burdened, institutions paralyzed, and suddenly the system fractures. The cause is not abstract. It is measurable, predictable, and, most importantly, preventable, but only if recognized in time. Look at France. The monarchy had years, even decades, to reform taxation, redistribute resources, or invest in public welfare. The aristocracy refused. When bread riots escalated into full-scale revolution, it was not luck that determined the fall, it was the predictable result of ignoring systemic stress. Russia mirrored this pattern. Tsar Nicholas II could have implemented reforms to alleviate famine, improve workers' conditions, or share power. He did none of these, and within months, centuries of autocracy vanished. The turning point in both cases was the same. Trust evaporated, and people stopped believing in the system that governed them. Once belief is gone, the system ceases to function. The United States today shows the same signs. The top 1% wields unprecedented influence over the economy and politics, while the middle class struggles under stagnating wages, debt, and housing crises. Social mobility is shrinking. Political polarization is escalating. Public trust in government, corporations, and institutions is at historic lows. The pattern is not just similar, it is almost identical to societies that face collapse. The numbers do not lie. Wealth concentration, economic precarity, and declining trust create a pressure cooker situation. The logical conclusion is stark. The outcome is not a question of if, but when. Societies that ignore these warning signs do so at their own peril. Inequality alone may simmer for years, but once the tipping point is reached, change happens fast, and it rarely favors the status quo. Revolutions, economic collapses, or sweeping political shifts are the historical endpoints. This is not fear-mongering, it is pattern recognition. Yet there is an insight here that offers hope. The pattern is predictable because it is rooted in human behavior, our need for fairness, security, and trust. Unlike natural disasters, financial storms, or wars, these patterns can be altered. Policies that redistribute wealth, protect the middle class, and restore trust in institutions have historically prevented crises from escalating. But ignoring them invites history to repeat itself. The aha moment is clear. The real risk is not the gap in dollars, it is the gap in trust. Empires fall, revolutions ignite, and economic systems collapse not because of money alone, but because people lose faith in the structures meant to protect them. If we read history carefully, the message is unambiguous. Wealth concentration without accountability destabilizes societies. And societies that ignore the warning signs do so at their own peril. The question posed at the start, could America follow France or Russia, is no longer hypothetical. The warning signs are already flashing. The real crisis is not measured in dollars, stock prices, or GDP figures. The real crisis is measured in trust. Trust between people, trust in institutions, and trust in the system that promises fairness and opportunity. When that trust erodes, no amount of wealth can stabilize a society. History has shown it again and again. Revolutions, collapses, and uprisings are born not from poverty alone, but from a collective sense of betrayal. We see it today. Millions of Americans feel left behind, struggling with debt, skyrocketing costs, and the sense that the rules are rigged for the few. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is no longer abstract. It is felt in neighborhoods, workplaces, and dinner tables across the nation. This isn't just an economic problem, it's a human problem. Fear, frustration, and hopelessness are powerful forces, and they can reshape nations overnight. Yet, there is power in awareness. Recognizing the pattern is the first step toward change. Civic engagement, policy reform, and a commitment to rebuilding social trust are not just noble ideals, they are practical necessities. Societies that respond before the breaking point can avert catastrophe. Individuals, too, can make choices that strengthen their communities, support fairness, and demand accountability from leaders. Ask yourself, what role do I play in this system? How do I contribute to the society I want to see? History doesn't wait for hesitation. It responds to action or the lack of it. The warning signs are here. The question is whether we will heed them, or whether we will repeat the mistakes of France, Russia, and countless other societies that ignored the cracks until it was too late. The future may yet be shaped, but only if we act before trust is lost forever. If you want to understand the next chapter in this unfolding story of wealth, power, and societal tension, stay with us. In the coming episodes, we'll explore how history's patterns are shaping today and what could happen next.